The master will kill anyone who dares, yet tonight I will vanish before his eyes, Ruth whispered to herself, heart hammering, as she pressed her back against the stable wall. The moonlight cut through the cracks in the wooden beams, illuminating the sweat and fear on her face. Outside, the distant laughter of the overseer echoed across the fields, unaware that the slave he considered property was about to rewrite her fate. One wrong step, one squeak of a hinge, and she would be dragged back to chains, or worse. The sun had long dipped below the horizon over the red-dusted fields of Montgomery, Alabama, casting long shadows that twisted like skeletal fingers across the plantation. Ruth's hands, calloused and trembling from the day's labor, moved mechanically, brushing hay into neat piles and tying the horses' bridles with precise knots. But her eyes, sharp, alert, restless, kept darting toward the distant tree line, toward the darkness that promised both terror and salvation. Something had shifted in the wind tonight. The usual creak of the gates and the low murmur of the overseer's whip felt different. Ruth felt it before she could name it. A moment when fear sharpened into something resembling hope. Her story had never been hers. Born into the shackles of Montgomery's oldest plantation, Ruth had learned the language of survival before she could even read or write. Her mother had whispered fragments of resistance in the dark, tales of ancestors who had slipped through chains, vanished into forests, rivers, and legends. Ruth carried these stories like small, secret flames, the only light she could call her own, in a world that had stripped everything else away. Tonight, that flame burned hotter. She had been planning this for weeks, or perhaps years, and yet her heart thumped as if she were still a child hiding from the master's wrath. The stable smelled of damp straw and manure, heavy and suffocating. But it was also the closest thing to freedom she could touch. Closing the gate, she felt the finality of it, a click that echoed louder than the distant shouts of men across the fields. This was no ordinary night. Tonight she would vanish. Ruth paused, her hand lingering on the latch, and listened. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. Her stomach knotted. Could they be too early? Or had her intuition betrayed her once again? No, she realized, this is it. The moment you wait your entire life for doesn't announce itself. It arrives silently, like smoke curling into the night sky. The past few months had been a careful balancing act. She had learned the guards' routines, the hours when the overseer's back was turned, when the master would retire into his mansion with a sense of invincibility. Each day, she memorized the paths through the woods, the hidden swamps, the creek that would mask her scent. She had gathered scraps of food, secreted them in folds of her skirt, and memorized the stars, the moss patterns on the trees, anything that would guide her to a world she had only ever imagined. Her fellow slaves noticed the change. Some whispered that Ruth had lost her mind, that the rest of them would be punished for her foolish dreams. Others, quieter and braver, watched her with a flicker of hope. She did not seek approval. She sought liberation. Every glance toward the horizon, every minute she lingered by the edge of the plantation, was a negotiation with fear itself. A creak from the loft above drew her gaze. She stiffened, pressing her body into the shadows. A lantern swung into view, held by one of the younger stable boys who often fetched water. His face was pale, frightened, yet unaware of the significance of the moment unfolding before him. Ruth gave the faintest shake of her head. He nodded, understanding the unspoken, and retreated. Her chest rose and fell in measured breaths. She could almost taste the cool night air beyond the gate, the smell of earth and leaves, the promise of obscurity. A step, another, closer. Fear gnawed at her, but she swallowed it down like a bitter medicine. She had rehearsed this moment until every second felt like a preordained rhythm. Tonight she would no longer be property. Tonight Ruth would become the story she had carried inside her all her life. The gate swung silently behind her, a muted protest from rusted hinges. One last glance at the stable, the warm, familiar smell, the shadows of the animals, the world she had known. And then she was moving, fast, silent, a ghost among the cornfields. Her bare feet pressed into the soft soil, the wind tugging at her skirts, carrying whispers of freedom she had only ever dreamed of. Her pursuers would not be immediate. The night was her ally, darkness her cloak. She slipped past the rows of tobacco, the manor lights shimmering like distant stars, and entered the woods. Every snap of a twig beneath her foot threatened to betray her, yet every breath she drew was a triumph over centuries of imposed silence. In the deep woods, she paused. The creek ahead murmured, the sound masking her presence. She crouched, listening to the pulse of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the low, almost inaudible sigh of the earth. She was no longer Ruth the slave. She was Ruth the fugitive, a woman claiming the world for herself. Yet fear remained. It was a shadow that clung, reminding her that the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers both natural and human. Wild animals, slave catchers, and the unforgiving wilderness awaited. But the fire inside her had grown too strong to be extinguished. With one final look over her shoulder at the dimly lit plantation fading into darkness, Ruth stepped into the creek, letting the icy water rise over her ankles, carrying her forward, into the unknown, somewhere deep in her chest. A memory whispered, "The night belongs to those who dare." She dared. And in that daring, Ruth Montgomery vanished, swallowed by the shadows and the promise of freedom. The creek's icy waters licked at Ruth's ankles as she pressed forward, each step deliberate, each breath measured. Her bare feet sank into the soft mud, leaving fleeting imprints that the wind and the darkness quickly erased. The plantation lights were gone now, swallowed by the forest, but the terror they carried lingered like a phantom pain. She knew that freedom was no longer a dream, but a perilous reality. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of a coyote, was a reminder that the night did not forgive, nor did it forget. Ruth crouched behind a thick grove of oaks, her lungs burning from the effort, her body slick with sweat and creek water. She dared not speak, dared not breathe too loudly. The chase could be upon her at any moment. She could almost feel the master's wrath closing in, the overseer's anger like a phantom presence pressing from behind. And yet, despite the fear, an exhilaration coursed through her veins, sharper than any pain she had ever known. This was freedom, raw and untamed. She was walking the knife's edge between life and death, and every heartbeat was a declaration that she would not go back. The forest around her was alive, and yet silent in the way that only darkness can be. Shadows shifted like living things, and every wind-stirred branch seemed poised to betray her. Ruth relied on the stories her mother had whispered to her, the lessons learned in hushed voices about hidden paths and safe havens. She followed the moss growing on tree trunks, the subtle incline of the land, the patterns of the stars just visible through the canopy. Her memory mapped the wilderness as if she had known it all her life, though she had never set foot here before. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time had lost meaning under the weight of urgency. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at her, but she forced herself onward, forcing her legs to carry her into the dense shadows. A sound, a soft crack, not her own, froze her mid-step. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a tree, heart hammering, listening. Another crack. Then a low voice murmuring angry. She can't have gotten far. Ruth's mind raced. The plantation's hunters, armed and merciless, were close. She considered fleeing deeper into the swampy undergrowth, but the ground was treacherous, thick with hidden roots and sudden pools of water that could swallow a foot in an instant. She forced herself to remain calm, retracing each step silently, letting the undergrowth cover her trail. Every instinct screamed, "Move, hide, survive." As she slipped through the brush, she stumbled across a small clearing where the moonlight pooled like silver water. In the center, a tangle of roots and reeds created a natural hiding spot. Ruth ducked into it, her body curling around the space, breathing shallow and silent. From here, she could hear the voices more clearly. Coarse men's voices, yelling commands, the clink of metal chains, the bark of dogs trained to hunt. Her stomach turned at the thought. If they found her now, there would be no mercy. But Ruth had not survived the plantation to be caught now. Drawing on the quiet strength her mother had instilled in her, she let the fear sharpen her senses. Every sound was a clue, every shadow a shield. The dogs drew closer, their paws thudding softly against the earth, noses twitching, bodies tense. Ruth closed her eyes, imagining herself invisible, her body blending into the reeds and roots, her spirit merging with the night. The searchers moved past the clearing without noticing her. Ruth remained still long after their voices faded, her chest heaving, her limbs trembling. Relief was fleeting. The forest was unforgiving, and she was alone with no food, no water, no certainty of where the path would lead. Yet the taste of victory lingered. She had evaded the first trap. She had taken the first step into freedom. By dawn, exhaustion forced Ruth to a shallow hollow beneath a fallen tree. She ate a handful of foraged berries, bitter but sustaining, and drank from a small stream, letting the icy water wash away the night's terror. As she rested, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. She was no longer a slave in sight, but survival required cunning and vigilance. The world beyond Montgomery was vast, and danger waited in every shadow. From wild predators to the slave catchers that roamed the countryside, Ruth's thoughts drifted to legends her mother had told her, of those who had escaped before, of people who disappeared into the darkness and were never found again. Some had been caught, some had perished, and some had vanished entirely, becoming whispers on the wind. Ruth wanted to be one of the latter, a name spoken only in hushed tones, a symbol of defiance. Yet she knew the forest would test her resolve, the swamp would demand her strength, and the rivers would challenge her endurance. Every step forward was a gamble with fate itself. By the time the sun broke through the canopy, casting shards of light across the forest floor, Ruth had covered several miles. Her muscles ached, her feet were blistered, but her determination had hardened into a quiet, relentless resolve. She paused atop a ridge, surveying the land ahead. Beyond the trees, she glimpsed the first signs of civilization, a distant farmhouse, smoke curling from its chimney. She did not know whether the inhabitants would help or hinder, but the sight reminded her that the world was vast, that she could navigate it, and that she had begun a journey from which there could be no return. Night would come again, bringing with it shadows and the threat of pursuit. But for now, Ruth allowed herself a sliver of hope. She had crossed the first threshold, survived the initial terror, and kept her body and spirit intact. The forest had tried to claim her. The pursuers had hunted her, and yet she remained, a living testament to courage and cunning. As she moved toward the distant farmhouse, Ruth whispered to herself, "I am more than chains, more than fear. I am Ruth of Montgomery. I will not be taken back." The words were a mantra, a prayer, a promise to herself and to the ancestors whose voices guided her through the night. And as the sun climbed higher, Ruth disappeared into the forest once more, relentless, unseen, and free, at least for this moment. The distant farmhouse had seemed like a beacon of hope in the dim forest. But as Ruth approached, the shadows of suspicion crept over her heart. Each step forward was a negotiation between necessity and fear. She knew that not all white settlers were cruel, yet in Montgomery, cruelty had 1,000 faces, each capable of ending her in an instant. She pressed herself against a line of thick brush, eyes scanning the clearing for signs of life. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Birds stirred nervously in the trees, and somewhere inside the house, she could hear the soft clink of metal and the low murmur of voices. Ruth's stomach growled. She had eaten only a handful of berries, and the creek water had chilled her to the bone. Hunger sharpened her mind as much as it gnawed at her body. She needed warmth, food, and possibly guidance, yet the risk of revealing herself was immense. Every instinct screamed, "Stay hidden, trust no one, survive alone." But another instinct, fiercer and more desperate, urged her forward, the chance that someone, anyone, might offer sanctuary. She crept closer, using the undergrowth for cover. The farmhouse was old, built from rough-hewn timber and stone, with a porch that sagged under years of neglect. Ruth's sharp eyes noted the signs of life, the faint smoke, footprints in the soft earth, a dog chained near the back door, its tail wagging slowly as it sniffed the air. The dog froze when it caught her scent, low growl rumbling from its throat. Ruth froze, heart hammering. She had been spotted. Then a voice called from the porch, soft but commanding. "Easy, boy, easy." The dog whined but did not move aggressively. Ruth exhaled, letting her shoulders relax just slightly. The voice belonged to a woman, older, dressed in plain garments, hair streaked with gray but eyes sharp and calculating. She appeared at the porch's edge, one hand resting on the dog's collar. Ruth could see every detail. The lines of worry etched across the woman's face, the tension in her posture. The woman studied the woods, then the creek, as if sensing Ruth's presence without needing to see her. "I know you're there," she said, voice steady. "Come out before you get yourself hurt." Ruth's pulse leapt. This was the moment of choice: reveal herself and hope for mercy, or retreat and risk exposure to the forest's dangers. Her hand instinctively went to the bundle she carried against her chest, the meager scraps of food, the few items she had gathered, and the small keepsakes she had taken from the plantation, talismans of courage and memory. Slowly, carefully, Ruth stepped from the shadows, 1 foot at a time, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. The dog barked once sharply, then settled again at the woman's side. The woman's eyes softened, but caution lingered. "You're far from home," she said, voice almost gentle now. "And you look like you've been running for your life." Ruth swallowed. "So I need help," she said, voice low but unwavering. I'm running from Montgomery. I have nowhere else to go." The woman's expression hardened briefly, then softened again. She studied Ruth, the dirt on her skin, the mud on her feet, the desperation in her eyes. She nodded slowly. "You've come a long way," she said, "and it seems the forest has kept you safe until now. Come inside, but be quiet. Danger follows anyone fleeing the law, or those who think they own the land and its people." Ruth stepped forward, relief mingling with suspicion. The warmth of the farmhouse washed over her, the faint smell of cooking food and burning wood, and for the first time in hours, or perhaps days, her body relaxed, just slightly. She allowed herself to hope that the woman might be an ally. Inside, the house was small but tidy. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The woman motioned for Ruth to sit on a rough wooden stool. She handed her a bowl of warm broth. "Eat," she said simply. "It'll do you good." Ruth's hands shook as she took it, sipping cautiously at first, then more freely as the warmth spread through her body. While Ruth ate, the woman observed quietly. After a few moments, she spoke again. "My name is Martha," she said. "I've helped others who ran from the plantations. But help comes with risks. If they catch you here, both of us could pay dearly." Ruth nodded, understanding immediately. Freedom was never without danger, and trust was a currency as fragile as glass. Martha leaned closer. "You must move again soon," she whispered. "The night is safest for travel, and there are others who can guide you farther north. But first you need strength and you need silence." Ruth absorbed every word. Her body was exhausted, but her mind raced with possibilities. Escape was no longer just a physical act. It was a network, a delicate map of allies, paths, and dangers. She realized then that freedom demanded courage, cunning, and patience beyond anything she had imagined. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest outside darkened once more. Ruth could hear the distant sounds of the night, the call of a fox, the rustle of branches, the whisper of the wind. But inside Martha's house, for a few brief hours, she felt the fragile comfort of safety. She drank the last of the broth, letting the warmth fill her, and prepared herself for the night ahead. Her journey was far from over. Hunter, master, and wilderness alike waited to claim her. Yet Ruth's resolve had only strengthened. She would move with the night, guided by allies like Martha, and by the unshakable will that had brought her this far. The forest was vast, the dangers many, but Ruth Montgomery was no longer simply running. She was navigating, surviving, resisting, and inching closer to a freedom that no chain could bind. As darkness fell completely, Ruth whispered to herself again, a mantra of defiance and courage. "I am Ruth of Montgomery. I will not be taken back. I will not be silenced. I will endure." Night had fallen fully, and Ruth's body, still warmed by Martha's hearth, began to stiffen in anticipation of the long trek ahead. The forest outside was a black expanse, dense with trees whose limbs clawed at the sky. She moved carefully, listening to the rustle of leaves, the distant call of nocturnal creatures, and the faint crackle of twigs under some unseen foot. Every step was calculated, every pause a battle against panic. Martha had given her instructions. Stick to the hidden paths, follow the moss on the north-facing trees, cross the creek silently, and never, ever trust a stranger without proof of their goodwill. The warnings echoed in Ruth's mind as she navigated the shadowed undergrowth. Her bare feet pressed against roots and damp soil, leaving marks that she hoped the wind would erase before any pursuers arrived. She hadn't traveled far before a sound made her freeze, a branch snapping, sharper than the ambient forest noises coming from behind. Heart racing, she flattened herself against a low-lying bush. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating movement. Two men, lanterns swinging in the darkness, calling out in hoarse voices. Ruth recognized them instantly, plantation hunters likely alerted by her absence. For a moment, sheer terror gripped her. She could run blindly, but the undergrowth was thick and treacherous, each step risking a fall or revealing her position. Ruth forced herself to breathe slowly, her mind racing. They would expect her to flee in panic. If she could use their assumptions against them, she might gain a critical advantage. She slipped sideways, low to the ground, hugging the shadows and the roots, letting the hunters pass too close to her hiding spot. One barked orders at the other, thinking she was further ahead. Ruth's pulse thundered, but she did not move. Once they vanished from her sight, she exhaled silently and pressed on. Stepping over roots, ducking under branches, guided by the silver threads of moonlight and her own desperate instincts. Hours passed in this tense rhythm. Move, hide, listen. Hunger gnawed at her. Fatigue threatened to sap her strength, and her feet were raw from constant contact with wet soil. But Ruth had trained herself to endure, to focus on immediate survival rather than distant uncertainties. Each decision was life or death, and each choice built the mental map she would rely on for the rest of her journey. By dawn, she reached a dense swamp, water rising above her ankles, mud threatening to trap her. She paused at the edge, knowing the swamp could both protect and kill. Ruth recalled the stories her mother had whispered, the people who had vanished into swamps and never returned, and those who had emerged stronger and unseen. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, letting the water pull at her legs. The reeds brush her arms, the mud cling to her skin. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the trees, a terrified human cry. Ruth froze, straining to hear. The sound was fleeting, swallowed quickly by the wind and the rush of the swamp waters. Her mind raced. Was it a trapped traveler, another runaway, or a warning from those who hunted her? She could not afford curiosity. She could not afford compassion. Yet instinct and empathy tugged at her, reminding her that she was not alone in this fight for survival. Hours later, when the swamp's threat lessened and she reached solid ground, Ruth allowed herself a brief rest beneath the canopy of towering pines. She pulled out the meager scraps of food she had kept, some dried fruit, a handful of hard biscuits, and ate them slowly, listening to the forest around her. Her body ached in ways it had never ached before, but her mind remained sharp. Every rustle, every distant noise, every shadow became a signal. She was learning, adapting, surviving. As the day progressed, Ruth found herself at the edge of a small river, its waters glinting under the late morning sun. Crossing would be perilous. The current was strong, and any splash could alert hunters or wildlife. She knelt, testing the depth with one foot, feeling the pull of the water. Slowly, cautiously, she began to wade across, letting the river carry her, her eyes scanning both banks. Midway, the current tugged harder, threatening to topple her, and she stumbled, catching herself on a submerged branch. Heart pounding, Ruth whispered a prayer, drawing on the strength she had built through weeks of preparation and fear. By late afternoon, she emerged on the opposite bank, soaked and exhausted but victorious. She allowed herself a brief smile, the first one in days. Freedom was not yet guaranteed, but every step forward reinforced her resolve. Every danger survived was a victory. Every obstacle overcome was a testament to her resilience. The shadows of evening crept back across the land, and Ruth knew she needed shelter soon. The forest was merciless at night, and predators, both human and animal, prowled unseen. She spotted a hollow beneath the roots of an ancient oak, partially concealed by ferns and vines. Crawling inside, she curled herself into as small a shape as possible, listening to the night. The low growl of a distant wolf, the chirp of crickets, the whisper of wind, as she drifted into a restless sleep. Ruth's thoughts returned to Montgomery, the plantation, The chains, the overseer's rage, and she steeled herself. Each night survived, each forest navigated. Each human encounter or narrow escape was part of a larger story she was writing for herself. One step closer to a life defined not by captivity, but by choice. When she awoke, the forest was alive with birdsong, the sun slicing through leaves in golden beams. Ruth stretched, her muscles stiff but her spirit unbroken. The path ahead was long, fraught with uncertainty, yet she faced it with the fierce determination that had carried her from the stable gate of Montgomery into the wild unknown. And somewhere, in the dark corners of the forest, the hunters were still searching, unaware that the shadow they sought had become something more than flesh, a living embodiment of courage, cunning, and an unyielding will to survive. Ruth awoke to the soft golden light of dawn filtering through the canopy of the forest. Her body ached from the previous day's trek, her feet raw and blistered, and her muscles stiff with fatigue. But the fire inside her, an unyielding flame of defiance and hope, remained alive. She knew that today she had to push further, deeper into the unknown, and trust in the instinct that had carried her this far. Martha's warning echoed in her mind. There are others who will help you further north, but you must remain cautious. Not everyone can be trusted. Ruth had clung to the memory of that advice as she navigated the dense forest. Every rustle of leaves and snapping twig, a reminder that danger was never far behind. By midday, she found herself at the edge of a small clearing, where smoke rose gently from a chimney. Unlike the farmhouse she had visited before, this structure was tucked into the woods, almost hidden, its walls covered in climbing ivy and moss. Ruth's heart raced. Could this be one of the safe houses Martha had mentioned, or was it a trap set by those who pursued her? She pressed herself into the undergrowth, watching, listening. Movement caught her eye. A man emerged from the doorway, sturdy and cautious, carrying a bundle of firewood. His eyes scanned the forest with a practiced wariness, and Ruth instinctively recognized the signs of someone who had experience with fugitives like her. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, hands raised slightly to show she meant no harm. I need help," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm running from Montgomery." The man froze, eyes narrowing, then softened. He lowered the bundle of wood and approached slowly, his hands empty and visible. "You've come a long way," he said quietly, "and you've been lucky to make it this far. Follow me inside, but be cautious. Danger follows those who flee." Ruth followed, stepping carefully into the small cabin. Inside, the warmth of a fire greeted her, and she inhaled the rich, comforting scent of cooking food and burning wood. The man introduced himself as Elias, a conductor in the network that helped runaways move north. He offered her a seat by the fire and handed her a bowl of stew. Ruth ate hungrily, the warmth filling her body and her spirit, while Elias watched silently, assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You've survived the forest, the swamps, and the hunters," Elias said finally. "Not everyone makes it this far. You're strong and smart, but your journey is far from over. There are others waiting along the path, people who will help and people who will betray. You must move carefully." Ruth nodded, absorbing every word. Her journey was no longer just a matter of survival. It was a test of judgment, intuition, and courage. Elias explained the route north, the safe houses, and the signals used by those in the network. Each piece of information was crucial, a lifeline in a world that sought to capture her at every turn. As night fell, Ruth prepared for the next stage of her journey. Elias provided her with a rough map and a small bundle of supplies: dried food, water, and a blanket. "Travel after dark," he advised. "Move silently. Trust only what you can see, and remember that freedom is worth every risk." Ruth left the cabin under the cover of darkness, the firelight fading behind her like a beacon of hope. The forest awaited, full of shadows and whispers, but she was no longer completely alone. She carried the knowledge of allies, the guidance of those who had survived before her, and the growing conviction that she could and would reach freedom. The path was treacherous, the nights long, and the dangers relentless. Hunters and wild predators prowled, rivers and swamps threatened to claim her, and exhaustion tested her body at every step. Yet Ruth pressed forward, driven by a force greater than fear. the desire for liberty, the refusal to be owned, the hope of a life she could call her own. By dawn, she had crossed several miles of rugged terrain, the forest gradually thinning into rolling hills and meadows. Each step forward was a triumph over the chains she had been born into, a declaration that she would not be silenced or subdued. She paused atop a ridge, gazing at the horizon, and whispered to herself, "I am Ruth of Montgomery. I will endure. I will survive. I will be free." Her journey north would be long and fraught with peril, but Ruth had discovered something vital. Courage and cunning were her greatest weapons, and the network of allies willing to help her was her shield. She was no longer merely fleeing. She was navigating, strategizing, and reclaiming her destiny one careful step at a time. The forest behind her fell silent, the dangers receding temporarily as the promise of freedom stretched before her like an uncharted road. Ruth pressed onward, her spirit unbroken, her resolve unwavering, knowing that every mile traveled was a step closer to the life she had always dreamed of, and a step further from the chains that sought to define her. The moon hung low over the hills as Ruth moved silently through the underbrush, the soft crunch of leaves beneath her feet, the only sound marking her passage. Her body ached, muscles burning with fatigue, but her mind remained razor-sharp. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl, every flicker of shadow demanded her attention. She had learned from Martha and Elias that the night was both a shield and a trap. One misstep could undo weeks of careful planning. Ruth paused atop a ridge, scanning the landscape below. The network had warned her of patrols, hunters from Montgomery, relentless and merciless, often moving in pairs with bloodhounds trained to follow even the faintest scent. And tonight she sensed them. There was something in the wind, a disturbance, a subtle shifting of leaves that set her nerves on edge. She ducked behind a thick oak, pressing her cheek to the rough bark, trying to steady her racing heart. A soft bark echoed through the valley below, followed by the distinct sound of voices calling out, sharp and commanding. Hunters. Ruth's stomach tightened, but she did not panic. She had survived this long by trusting her instincts, and now they would serve her again. Crouching low, she edged along the ridge, moving silently, letting the shadows hide her. Her bare feet slipped over moss-covered rocks, roots, and fallen branches. She knew the hunters would expect her to flee recklessly, to panic and give herself away. But Ruth had a different plan. She would let them come close, then vanish like a ghost into the forest. The hunters drew nearer, their lanterns swinging, casting long beams of light that pierced the darkness in fragmented lines. The dogs sniffed eagerly, noses twitching, but Ruth had learned the forest's tricks. She ducked into a thick thicket, brushing her hand over mud and leaves to cover her scent. The dogs barked and whined, circling the area, but Ruth remained motionless, blending seamlessly with the shadows. For what felt like hours, she held her breath as the hunters moved past, their voices fading as they argued about losing the trail. Ruth exhaled slowly, relief washing over her, but she knew better than to linger. The forest offered no true sanctuary. She pressed onward, deeper into the trees, following a path she had memorized from Elias's guidance, winding toward a distant ridge that would provide temporary cover and a vantage point. The terrain grew treacherous. Fallen logs blocked her path. Streams of icy water forced her to balance on slippery stones, and dense undergrowth clawed at her clothes and skin. At one point, she misstepped on a moss-covered root, nearly plunging into a narrow creek. Her hands scraped against jagged rocks, leaving shallow cuts, but Ruth clenched her teeth and pressed on. Pain was a companion she could not afford to indulge. Survival required focus. As she navigated a particularly dense portion of the forest, a sudden rustle to her left made her freeze. Her heart leapt into her throat as a figure emerged, human, moving with stealth. But unlike the hunters, there was no aggression in the posture, only caution. Ruth's hand instinctively went to the small knife she carried, though it was barely more than a token of defense. The figure raised a hand slowly. "Easy," a whisper came. "I'm not here to harm you. You must be Ruth of Montgomery." Ruth's eyes narrowed, distrust blazing. "Who are you?" she demanded, voice low but sharp. "My name is Daniel," the man said softly. "I've helped others escape. I was told to watch for someone like you. You're not alone, but you must move quickly. Hunters are on your trail, and the forest ahead is dangerous. There are cliffs, swift rivers, and predators. If you're not careful, you'll be caught or worse. Ruth weighed her options. Trust was dangerous, yet she had no choice if she hoped to survive. Slowly she nodded. Daniel led her along a hidden path, a route Elias had described in vague terms, but Ruth had not yet traversed. They moved silently, the forest thick and oppressive around them. Daniel's knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable. He pointed out hidden pitfalls, warned of loose soil along steep banks, and taught her subtle techniques to mask her scent from the dogs. Night deepened, and the forest seemed alive with threats. A sudden howl of a wolf made Ruth freeze, heart pounding as the sound echoed through the valley. Daniel whispered instructions, guiding her into a small hollow that offered temporary safety. Ruth pressed herself against the earth, listening to the night, muscles coiled, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Hours later, as the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Ruth allowed herself a moment of cautious relief. She had survived another night, evaded hunters, navigated treacherous terrain, and made it through the forest's deadly traps. But the journey was far from over. North lay miles of wilderness, rivers to cross, and the ever-present threat of capture. Ruth's resolve hardened with each step. She had begun as a slave, bound by chains and fear, but with every obstacle overcome, every danger evaded, she was becoming something else. A survivor, a strategist, a force to be reckoned with. Her path was perilous, yet she pressed on, guided by the knowledge that freedom, though distant, was worth every sacrifice. As the sun rose higher, Ruth and Daniel paused atop a ridge, surveying the terrain ahead. The forest stretched endlessly, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. She looked at her companion, gratitude mingling with wariness. Trust was a fragile thing, yet necessary. Ruth understood that alliances, carefully chosen, could mean the difference between life and death. "I won't be caught," she whispered to herself, voice steady, eyes burning with determination. "I will survive. I will endure. I will be free."